does. Search but you stay lost. We are reaching for the stars, but we're making this too hard, and I wonder where you are.
Central locus of trust, one central point of failure or administrative control over the system. But then when we get to this regulatory question, we need to ask what's actually happening and what are our concerns? And I think one can start with looking at the text of the securities laws, but the reality is capital markets today look nothing like they did in the 1930s. They look nothing like they did probably in the 1970s or 1980s. We've had tremendous, unbelievable technological innovation and change. And so, for example, Rebecca is right that what it means to have a multi-sig contract for emergency suspension of a DeFi protocol is different than what a circuit breaker is in equities or other capital markets today. But those are both mechanisms of dealing with a real problem, which is in these complex adaptive markets, we have things like emergent harms. We have things like flash crashes happening, which is something that maybe didn't happen in the 1930s. Lots of other things happened in the 1930s. And so we need to think about what are the mechanisms consistent with both our ideals and our legal structure to address them. And so I think we need to come back and start with the concerns. And Rebecca earlier on mentioned several concerns about DeFi. My group, the Wharton Blockchain and Digital Asset Project, did a report on DeFi in 2021, actually 2 papers with the World Economic Forum. One's called DeFi Beyond the Hype. One's called DeFi Policymaker Toolkit. And in the toolkit, we go through 6 broad categories of risks and start to unpack how we might think about it. They don't all call for regulation. I'll just list them and then stop. But we should think about what do we need to do and what can we do most effectively in ways that have the minimum cost to innovation and to our values, things like freedom of speech, as Peter described, how to address them in the best possible way. We talked about financial risks. There are risks to investors in participating in these markets, various kinds of financial risks. There are technical risks, which I think is largely what's being described here under the rubric of cyber risk. But remember, these are all software systems in DeFi and blockchain. So everything at some level is a cyber risk, but there certainly are vulnerabilities and attacks and issues in the coding of the software. There are operational risks, things like key management, things like governance. There are legal risks in terms of these systems being used for illicit purposes. And there are emergent risks, things like flash crashes and flash loans and so forth, that are novel kinds of results of interacting systems. And so I think what should regulators do? They should go through and catalog the risks and then identify the appropriate ways consistent with the law to address those risks that are the most advantageous. And then to the extent that the law does not allow for that, think about how the law needs to change.
Great. So I'm going to go to Michael Jordan and then Gabe. Everybody chuckles when I say Michael Jordan here, right? But anyway, I'm going to go to Michael in a minute and then Gabe. But Eric, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to say. If not, that's okay. But if there's anything you wanted to say in light of some of the comments from Kevin.
Yeah, you're right. I shouldn't have said perfect. That's fair. I think what's important here is not that that the smart contracts are perfect regulators, but that they are a step function improvement over human regulators, frankly. A famous or a wise person once said that America was special because it is a nation of laws and not of men. This is an appeal to the rule of law, basically the idea that a society that can move to a non-arbitrary form of rule is better than one that is based on the arbitrary whims of any human. Some people are good, some people are bad, many people are bad and they think they're good. But no matter what, we're all subjective humans and we make mistakes and we're squishy in our points of view. Smart contracts are not squishy. They execute exactly according to the code. And when there is a problem, as there often is, you can patch it, you can fix it, you can upgrade it, and you can know a priori how the system will actually operate. You can never do that with men, with human regulators. This is a step function improvement. And so far from being a tool of anarchy, cryptocurrency, blockchains, DeFi should be seen as a tool of ultimate order. And that's a very different kind of perspective, I think, that is worth noting.
So before getting to Michael, Rebecca.
Just very briefly, I want to pick up on something that Omid and Kevin both said, but Omid had said trust is the only product of the financial services industry. And I think even with the heavy regulation we have on the financial services industry, both via the SEC and the CFTC and the numerous other regulators that we have in the US, which is very different than other systems around the world, I think there is very little trust in the financial services industry, and Bitcoin was born of that lack of trust in many ways. And that, to Eric's point, we need laws because humans do all have subjective judgment. We all are coming from different interactions and different backgrounds. And one of the ways to architect this trustlessness that we find in DeFi, and to pick up on what Jill said, that even in the case of unanticipated events, large volatility, DeFi code or smart contracts will continue to operate as intended as long as it was tested and alike in the right way. And so while I agree that one of the best things we can do, as Kevin said, is to look at all the different risks, I think we have to take a step back and look at the source of risk, because even if a risk is user loss, where it comes from may be very different than in the traditional securities markets, which is errors in human judgment or holding on to data. And I think most regulators around the world have said, this is a complex question. We cannot solve it in the way we're used to. And even some of the French prudential regulators have put together private French-only working groups to try to figure out this DeFi question, and have put out even sandboxes to say, well, we could do cyber assessments and green light certain types of DeFi protocols to give users the information they need to be able to have the trustlessness to engage in DeFi.
So Michael, I'm gonna just frame up what Rebecca was saying for a sec, 'cause I think it'll probably be something we come back to. And then Michael, I'll come to you with a question. So I think, Rebecca, to what you were saying, if I got it right, and just to build on, you got, and others are making similar points, right? You got the risk, what is it? What's the nature of it? What have you? But then you have the whole nother cascade of questions that then flow from that, if I'm hearing what, again, a number of folks are saying, which is, for example, among other things, you got the risk. What's the nature of it? What's the magnitude of it? How would you regulate it if you wanted to regulate it effectively? At what cost? What are the trade-offs associated with trying to regulate it, whatever it is, in a particular way or another? And then you have another question, which maybe we'll kind of park for now, come back to later if folks want to, which is, even if you find answers and say, you get to the end of that list of questions, there are other questions that you could tease out. You get to who ought to be the one regulating it, right? So that's yet a whole other question. And that can be a function of regulatory expertise. It can also be a function of just statutory authority, which of course that can change in terms of what legislative action there may be. So the who ought to regulate, I think, is a really just important question, the authority question, the expertise question, that itself can be difficult to answer as if all the other questions were somehow easy. Those are difficult too, but then you have the who ought to regulate it, which has its challenges in terms of just trying to zero in on what the right answer is. But Michael, feel free at this point to comment on anything, because we've talked about a lot of stuff, but I was interested in something very specific, because you have a lot of experience on the investing side of things. And so when you're investing and working with those who are investing, you need to think about a whole host of things that are going to speak to whether or not this particular opportunity, this particular business, has long-term success that on a risk-adjusted basis is worth allocating capital to, as compared to whatever the next best alternative happens to be. And there's a lot that goes into that. Part of that, of course, is just flat out, what's the business opportunity? On the upside, part of that is what's the risk environment look like? And then part of that is what's going to be the risk management, the compliance requirements, and then to what extent does that actually hinder the ability to achieve the upside, right? So you kind of figure all that stuff out. Doing that in this particular context, where there's all the questions that the panelists have raised, the comments from the commissioners and Chairman Atkins, how do you factor that in terms of the investing, yes, don't, in this particular project, whatever it happens to be? And then relatedly, is there a particular something the SEC could do that would make at least that calculus an easier calculus. Another way to put that is to wring some of the uncertainty out of it, so at least you have a better sense as to what it is that you're investing in, both in terms of the opportunity as well as the associated risks?
A multidimensional question, but I'll start with a talk we gave at our research conference that said that tokens are broken. We think that tokens are broken for investors, for founders, for users of DeFi systems. And the reason they're broken is something that SEC can help us with, which is right now, it is more profitable to listen to user demand. We have a founder of a great protocol here. He is competed by people willing to take shortcuts. And the shortcuts are things that users want him to do because it's cheaper, faster, and simpler. We have created an environment that makes it harder for the teams to do it the right way. What we need to do is create a golden bridge that everyone crosses. That is where the best capital, the best founders, and the right set of outlines for what you're going to do if you want to access this market live. The way we can do that is reacting to the common pattern we've seen in this industry of we have a new demand for use. Someone wants to do something. Our technology is not quite ready for it. We have to make a compromise. It's too complicated to store your private keys. So you give it to someone else. That someone else doesn't do what they're supposed to do. A lot of leverage builds up and we have a crisis and we have to remedy it. In our view, the right way to do this is to give the good actors like Jill and like Stani the equivalent foot to compete with people who do not follow the same rules. And so the market does not know the difference between a lemon and a peach. And the goal of good regulation should be to help people like us price those and market those correctly.
You have a concrete example or a concrete something that'll
so a concrete thing that happens. Eric talked about this a little bit. Crypto systems are perfectly verifiable and auditable. We have no issues with that, and people like me get on stage and broadcast that. The problem is what happens outside the protocol. There are market maker agreements where people will pay for transaction volume that are not legible to the market. The market can't synthesize that information and price that is incentivized activity versus what looks like natural activity. Those off-chain agreements need to be disclosed if someone wants to participate in them in our market.
Is that one last question? Then I'm going to come, Gabe, to you. So just, Michael, one last question on that. You use a word that is coming up a lot in the discussions, which is activity or activity. So from what you just described, would you agree, and I don't want to speak for Rebecca, but in terms of what I believe she was saying by way of the activities-based approach, and tell me if I'm mischaracterizing in any way, that's the right way, setting aside what any particular regulation should or shouldn't be, setting aside what any particular risk warrants additional regulation, setting all those big questions to the side, just as in terms of an overall approach. Would you agree with the perspective that some have expressed, focus on activities as a way to think about it wherever that leads?
It's the only way to do it. The reason is the technologists like myself, former software engineer, will come up with a new way to provide the activity if we regulate the technology. If we regulate the agreement, someone will circumvent it. It's about the activity. What you're seeing in DeFi today, there's a market called Hyperliquid that is dominating market share. They're making changes to their software to make it more performance because users want more performance. We need to make sure users understand what they're using and why. And you cannot do that by any other way than what is the action activities being offered by the platform.
Gabe. So once again, given that we've covered a lot of territory, feel free to respond and react and build on anything that's been said. But one of the things that I thought I'd tee up here is, as I understand it, that you yourself spend a lot of time thinking about innovative legal frameworks that get at all the things that have been a focus of discussion here today. So what are some of those innovative legal frameworks, in some sense, picking up on a lot of the different points that have been made, some of which are about regulatory frameworks, some of which are about risks, some of which are about opportunities, some of which are about technology, some of which are about just kind of a different mindset and construct with which to even engage the discussion. which is not easy when we have a very established frameworks and constructs for how regulatory regimes have been built. So in some sense, easier said than done. But as somebody like yourself who thinks squarely about that, how to innovate these sorts of legal and regulatory constructs, I presume it's also the case kind of organizational constructs as well, which you can think of as a form of regulation, even if it's not rules and regulations and statutes and law. Organizational structure has a way of channeling behavior, et cetera, activities and the like. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I think we're starting to get into the weeds a little bit. A lot of the conversation has been very high level, but I think the devil's in the details, and I like the devil. There's a few things I would say. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything everyone has said. Yes, you have to look at, there's the system, and then there's the roles of various people acting on it. But we have just had many years of lawsuits and other things around facts and circumstances based tests, namely the Howey test. And I think that no one liked that very much. No one wants to analyze in excruciating detail the facts and circumstances of what everyone is doing on every different system in every different way every single time. So we do have to look at all these things, but the end goal of looking at those things should, in my opinion, be to divide things into categories and players into categories and have rules so that people know where they are. And of course, there are always edge cases. Yes, that's why we go to the SEC and we talk to them. We get no action letters, or we have litigations to figure out the edge cases. But we should be driving toward rules. And I believe there is a difference, as Michael was saying, between a decentralized autonomous system and a system that just happens to be on a blockchain but isn't actually decentralized and autonomous. And we're going to need in law some recognition of this, where these lines are. They may not be perfect. There may be edge cases, but we're going to need it. Now, I do think that, in terms of why are we doing this? Why does it matter? What is on which side of that line? Well, the reason is that basically, if you do this right, if you have a decentralized autonomous system, it's not that there's no trust in no one and that no people are involved, or it's this beautiful transcendental machine, but rather you don't necessarily have to trust your direct counterparty. And the things that you are trusting in generally are not individual people's discretion or that they're good people or whatever, but it's rather their incentives and their powers, right? And so what regulation should do and what legal constructs should do is help support this wonderful feature. Because if the United States and North Korea can transact on a blockchain, or if two powerful corporate competitors can transact on a blockchain, where typically they would have to use, you would have to put millions and millions of dollars into a bank escrow, and they would worry, what country is the escrow in? Does the president of that country know the president of that bank, or whatever? You don't have to do that anymore. You do it on the blockchain, and you can just trust in a broadly distributed, geographically diverse group of validators, incentives, and their very limited powers, right? So the way that law can support this is a few things. Number one, there are some things that aren't on chain, as Michael was talking about. There are market maker agreements. There may be agreements between the validators of a protocol and the labs company or foundation of a protocol where they're getting subsidized in certain ways. That is very important information to everyone to know, because that changes their powers and incentives potentially, right? So we need a notice and disclosure regime that captures these potential conflicts of interest or these potential off-chain things. Number two is many things are trust minimized by the systems themselves, right? But there are some things that are not trust minimized by it. So Rebecca mentioned the case of a multi-sig, an emergency multi-sig that can stop a protocol, and that could be very trust minimized. Like maybe the only thing you can do is you can stop the trading and you can turn it into withdrawal only mode, but there's no way that this multi-sig can withdraw the money. Well, still, nevertheless, there could be that multi-sig could just it's only supposed to be for emergencies and hacks, but maybe a government just really doesn't like the protocol and it sends everyone an order to just stop it because it doesn't like it, or because one of its enemies is transacting on it, right? And so there can be, there should be some legal arrangements still that say, okay, you're supposed to be an emergency multisig. Let's define emergency. Let's define what you will disclose your conflicts of interest. Let's define, is there some procedure that perhaps can happen where instead of doing something bad that people have been told to do, they just resign from it and control reverts to the DAO, right? So, I call these things cybernetic organizations, AKA Borgs, where basically you have a mix of legal protections and smart contract protections. In that example, the smart contract protection is that there's not very much they can do to the protocol. They can turn off the trading and they can turn it into withdrawal only mode. That would be a smart contract protection. And the legal protection would be the procedure whereby you define what an emergency is, when they're supposed to act, and when they're not supposed to act. Right. So I do think that law has an important role here in sort of bringing out the best of this technology's capabilities to allow potential adversaries even to still commercially transact.
So, so Gabe, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up of you. Then we go to Peter. One, I think Peter has a thought. Number two, I'm going to give Peter the chance to talk about low for a moment. But I would encourage everybody else, since we've now gotten through and there's already been some interaction, if you want to just catch my attention, wave your hand, what have you, I can get the queue going. We'll get through what we can in the next 15 minutes or so before the break, and then we'll pick up on it, as well as with the benefit of the audience and their input after the break. So feel free to get my attention if there's anything you want to talk about. Hopefully there is. I'll create the list. But Gabe, real quick, and then Peter, to you. So in terms of what you're saying, kind of the cybernetic construct that you just mentioned, for the SEC, so I'm sitting back putting my former hat on. I'm like, all right, that's really interesting stuff. So now what do I do? Right? So we just gotta get to that very bottom line question, particularly when you think about it from the perspective of the SEC's authority. And to the extent, part of the answer is, hey, these are really interesting things, but they're really for somebody else, whatever your thoughts are. But I think that would be useful to see how what you said kind of translates for agencies like the SEC or perhaps other financial regulators.
Right. It's the SEC fundamentally has a disclosure mandate. And I think that is a very, very powerful innovation. I realize people in crypto currently think it's very bad, but at its core, and there have been many things. Look, there have been many things that make it perhaps not ideal, because there have been layers and layers of things where it's creeped from a disclosure regime into somewhat of a conduct regulation regime. Right, like if you you force everyone to do environmental disclosures, that can end up being a conduct regulation because they don't like the things they would have to disclose as a result of that, and so they change their conduct. But at its core, and then there's things like Sarbanes-Oxley, which have so many layers of auditing and certifications and controls. These would be completely inapplicable to crypto, right? But if you just go back to the core intuition that investors and other types of operators should have all material information that they would want to have to reasonably make intelligent decisions about things. Not everything in crypto is on chain, right? And so you have to look at where the potential conflicts of interest, where are the rooms for collusion, where are the ways people could break these systems and require disclosure around those. That would be enormously useful. And I think that's really all you need. You don't need to regulate conduct that much. And the other thing would be to recognize where the information is already transparent, it's already on chain. Then you don't go and require redundant disclosure because everyone can already see that, right? And so it is different, but it's a disclosure mandate, and the SEC would be good at that.
Peter.
The initial thought I had is that, we're not going to want, say, an emergency on a particular specified escape hatch multi-sig contract to be something that the SEC defines, right? This would be a mess of a rulemaking that I can only imagine the kind of feedback we get from a public comment process. What you want is an emergent order here where people feel comfortable disclosing exactly how they want to set up their system and making very clear to the user how they're going to set up their system, such that when they betray those expectations, you can pursue fraud claims against them. Now, an interesting question is, can we just use typical fraud jurisdiction? Do we want to use the SEC's anti-fraud jurisdiction? And are there issues with things that aren't swept into that? Would there still be things left on the table? And so, briefly, I put in my 2 cents. I think when you have a new emergent marketplace with new actors who are doing new and novel things, you actually want more of an organic regulatory model where people can define their own terms and then can be prosecuted for fraud for failure to live up to those terms. You don't want a prescriptive regulatory regime where people are forced to fit into buckets that have been defined ex ante by a regulator. Even if that regulator is very smart, they're going to be short-sighted with respect to all the many flowers that will bloom in that world. And so, briefly, to try and bodge this together with what I wanted to say about SEC versus Lowe is you have an example of First Amendment jurisprudence here where, we have to figure out where the line is between conduct that we can require a license for or registration for ex ante versus conduct that you're going to be allowed to do, even if it generates risks, and we will only police you after the fact. So Lowe is this disgraced investment advisor he loses his right to be an investment advisor, which is a regulated professional conduct category by the SEC. And instead, he decides to start publishing a newsletter for like 25 cents a page. And in the newsletter, you'll find all of Lowe's best stock tips. And it just so happens that Lowe gets money from the people who issue these garbage stocks and then profits off of having them in his newsletter. But the newsletter is just something that anyone can buy. And this case stretched the SEC's jurisdiction right up to the First Amendment in a way that's hopefully fairly obvious, in that the SEC said, no, you're still an investment advisor. We told you you can't do that anymore. You're supposed to register, and you're actually banned from doing this because you did it so badly before. Ultimately, when this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and White said, actually, I'm free to, Lowe said, I'm free to publish my newsletter. It doesn't have personal advice in it to clients. I don't have clients. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Lowe. Justice White authored the deciding opinion in a concurrence and said, look, I'm not endorsing this conduct. Things that get written can be bad. But in this case, this person is engaged in the publication of speech. And figuring out what the difference is between publishing that newsletter that anyone can buy, it's not taking fees, by the way. Commissioner Peirce rightly mentioned Ether Delta and the Zach Coburn enforcement action, where one of the fact patterns was that he could adjust the fee on the decentralized smart contract or decentralized exchange smart contract. It's not just taking fees, because Lowe published this newsletter for a fee and got lots of money from the shady penny stock people who wanted their stocks in the newsletter. What Justice White said in his concurrence is that there's a difference between that neutral publishing activity and regulatable conduct, where one takes the affairs of their customer in hand and exercises judgment on their behalf. And so if you want a good standard for when suddenly you can be subject to some sort of regulation, I think you're right there. If you take the affairs of the customer in hand by designing an emergency escape hatch that you describe clearly, and then you betray those expectations, you're now engaged in something that looks like conduct that can be subject to regulation and not engaged in pure speech. So hopefully I mix those two things together. But
Got it. Eric.
Yeah, I worry that this disclosure thing is a bit of one of those good intentions that paves the way to hell. I don't imagine many of you are happy going to a website and clicking on accept all every single time you visit a new website because of GDPR compliance. Does anyone believe that that has improved the human experience? No. How many of you, when you get a new credit card, read through the 15 pages of sometimes capital letters, sometimes bold, sometimes small print, to make sure that you have read all of the regulated disclosures provided by the credit card company? You don't. These things have a way of snowballing, and a much more reasonable, civil, freedom-oriented way to handle this stuff is through the notion of fraud. Basically, in your example, if a new project is doing some kind of market maker deal, well, if you're going to invest in that project, you should perhaps ask them if they're doing that kind of thing. Ask them to affirm something, ask them to deny something. It can be in a public setting, a public message board or anything like that. They will then have to answer. If they don't answer, maybe that's a red flag and you should stay away from that investment. And if they answer and then they act not in accordance with their own statements, now that is fraud. That seems like a very appropriate way to actually go after bad actors because they're actually committing fraud. There are too many different types of things that might have to be disclosed for this idea that disclosure should be a regulated forcing function. it sounds good, and it's going to lead to the experience of DeFi and crypto getting much worse. And I think now is probably the time to not tread down that road.
Why doesn't requiring Apple to do disclosures make the experience of using an iPhone worse?
Which disclosures are you talking about?
Their 10Ks, their 8Ks, their SEC disclosures that they make. It doesn't affect using an iPhone at all, and it does help the market value Apple stock, get ahead of issues, know that their financials are accurate. Yeah, I don't quite get it.
I have no problem with Apple deciding to disclose things because huge investors with billions of dollars demand that kind of information.
But they're legally, yeah, but it's not really scalable for financial markets, right? Part of the reason why the capital markets, the capital equity markets work beautifully is, every individual investor doesn't go and have to talk to Apple management, right? It's just disclosed. And, it's also not, because they're required to say certain things, as you say, they must actually say something in order for it potentially to be fraudulent. Everyone has the same information. They don't have to go and actually talk to Apple about it. And, everyone's in parity. I think there's a certain beauty to that. Now, it can go too far, obviously, and there are trade-offs, right? But this is part of why markets work and why, Apple can trade at Apple stock can trade at great scale by many institutions, is because we've solved that social scaling problem through law. Everyone gets the same information.
Standards of disclosure can absolutely be handled by marketplaces. Like if you're an exchange and you want to be reputable and you want to draw volume to yourself, it's in your interest and it's in the interest of your customers for the assets that you list to provide certain information that you think is appropriate. And I think it's not a scary world to imagine that different exchanges might have different listing requirements. That's okay. It's okay if not everyone does the same thing. It's okay if not everyone is forced into the same regime. And that flexibility, that dynamism is precisely the thing that allows markets to grow and for innovations to happen. There's a lot of, if you go into this disclosure issue, a lot of the reason that crypto tokens are not securities is because to become a security, registered as a security, they would have to abide by these disclosures, many of which don't even apply to them. And
absolutely, you would have to tailor the disclosure regime. I would just leave you with one question, and we should probably let other people talk.
Then we're going to move on.
But one quick question just to think about. Why were these disclosure rules invented in the first place? Why didn't, in the Roaring 20s, when it was a very free market, why didn't all these people get together and just start disclosing these things? Why did we have to pass a law about it?
We can bracket that. Maybe come back after the break if folks think that going down further the disclosure. To the extent disclosure, it's interesting because disclosure is often seen as a less burdensome regulatory technique than substantively regulating conduct or activities as such. And yet disclosure can be difficult as well to craft a disclosure-based regime that itself is effective in terms of what's disclosed, how it's disclosed, when it's disclosed, how frequently it's disclosed, and all the rest. So it's notable just as a general proposition that while disclosure is sometimes seen as easier than conduct-based or substantive-based or activities-based regulation, it is by no means easy. And part of it is thinking about, from my perspective, part of it is thinking about the ways in which those to whom the information is being disclosed actually engage with the information. Does it actually improve their decision-making, or does it frustrate their decision-making in a way where disclosure may prove to be counterproductive? So it can be a complicated crafting the right disclosure regimes in any particular context can be complicated, setting aside this particular context. So I think there's probably more to come back to on all of that. But let me go to Jill.
Thank you. As both a consumer of products in the DeFi space and the broader blockchain ecosystem, and also a founder behind some of them, I am strongly motivated by both the value and the value proposition of transparency. And for that reason, I think that disclosures, whether they're mandated from an oversight body or a regulatory body, or whether they have just become industry best practice, I think they're enormously helpful. I'm speaking even from my own personal experience as a consumer. As I mentioned earlier, these systems are extraordinarily complicated under the hood. I don't read the 15-page credit card agreement when I sign up for a new card, nor do I audit my own smart contracts as a consumer when I'm using products. But in both cases, I think the transparency and the fact that there are people in each respective industry who are scrutinizing these transparent details is extremely helpful. It's not an enviable position to be in, to either be on the industry side and trying to promote self-regulation, or to be an oversight body to try to walk the line between being overly burdensome and creating a regime and a set of best practices that people abide by that is actually helpful to consumers. I want to touch very briefly on what I think is at stake on that front. If I was to draw a thread through my career, a common theme has been the great assets that the United States has in terms of being able to attract capital, both due to the dynamics around its capital markets and due to the power and the strength of the US dollar as a means of savings and of payments. I live in Silicon Valley, San Francisco. It is the hub of innovation globally. Every social network, every AI application that you use, that you have on your phone, has been invented there. I am one of a handful of crypto founders left there. I want to emphasize that. This was not the case 5 or 6 years ago. It used to be a buzzing hub of crypto activity. It is rare these days to come by someone who is still living not just in Silicon Valley, but in the United States, who is an entrepreneur in this space. And it's due to the regimes that not only the US as a government and as an ecosystem and as a set of institutions has imposed, but it's also due to the challenging aspects that Michael Jordan touched upon earlier as an industry ourselves of the practices that have been created. There's been a chilling effect throughout the industry, especially for those domiciled in the United States, and especially on the best, most scrupulous actors in the industry. People sometimes say to me and they question, oh, you still work in crypto? I thought that it was, just sort of frauds and bad actors left there. And that's because if it feels like it's illegal to work in crypto, if it feels like you're doing something bad, it's going to drive out those most scrupulous actors, either outside of the United States or out of the industry altogether. And that's far too often been the case. And I think that it's critical that we don't create overly burdensome disclosure regimes or other regulatory regimes and further drive out the good, well-intended actors. But I also think it's critical that we have norms around transparency so that those who are trying to create best practices that do protect consumers and retail users and investors can thrive and compete against those who are less scrupulous.
All right, so we're at about time for the break, so as not to go over and make sure we have the proper break. So here's the game plan. Somebody from the commission is going to give a couple of instructions in a moment. For the queue, I have Omid and Rebecca. There are probably others. So the others can just come up to me during the break. I'll get the list going. Comments and questions that have come in from the audience, we'll fold those into the discussion. And I guess that's it for now, other than a couple of instructions.
Hello. It's my last chance at the mic during these roundtables, so thank you for indulging me. I want to thank everyone on the panel. I followed many of your work and thinking for so many years, and I appreciate that those of you who have stayed in the U.S. and continue to build. I value your contributions today. You have really defied my expectations. Innovation always feels quick because most of the time, by the time we're exposed to new technology, it has already achieved commercial success and scaled. We see the fully baked product and quickly lose appreciation for the process. A lot of the points made today about the American spirit have really resonated with me. Even my elementary age children understand the promise of freedom that America promises. They remind me on an almost daily basis that they can't wait to grow up. because once they do, they won't have to ask permission to engage with a technology that we greatly limit in our house. That's right. They can't wait to have permissionless access to ice cream. We take for granted all the innovation that makes ice cream readily available for us. Hand churns, large-scale factories, and refrigeration. The rules and regulations around the availability of ice cream took decades to standardize, and as a result, we have a somewhat consistent and delicious ice cream experience. We will now take a short break where we, as adults, can have as many ice creams as we want. I invite you to go to the lobby and enjoy some ice cream. When we return, the panel will turn to answering questions from the audience. There are note cards available outside that you can fill out any questions that you have, or you can submit them, as Tori mentioned, at crypto@sec.gov. Ileana is here, and she can take your cards from you, or I can take them as well, and we'll get them to Troy to ask our panelists. So thank you. Please enjoy your ice cream, and see you back here at 3:30.
All righty. So I want to do a quick talk. Made the mistake of waiting the first 20 minutes because I wanted to avoid this break that they have thing. And sadly, their media player that they're using doesn't have a rewind, so I couldn't go back and replay the first 15 minutes, which it was just them, just their intro. I wanted to catch like some of the professors that they're being interviewed today or talking as witness in the roundtable. But like I said, made the mistake because normally that's what I do with the YouTube version when they're talking in Capitol Hill. I give them like 10, 20 minutes, and then when they take that break, I can just skip to the live version, and then it just brings them back up. But on this one, it'll be different. So maybe we'll replay the first 15 minutes so we can catch the intro. So once it's done, we might be able to do that. If not, we'll just discuss it on Spaces probably on Saturday. If not, we might just have another space during the week, because I think these conversations are very important. It's a bit disappointing that only one person now is watching this when we're constantly having all these key opinion leaders talking about how important DeFi is and how important all this is. But I knew that it wasn't going to be like a popular topic. I like covering these because I think that it's in our best interest. If not, they'll continue to impose all these new rules, all these new hurdles. Like that's how I see it. It's a hurdle. You know, they're not helping DeFi as it was designed. Excuse me. At least today, they're talking a little bit about the technology. They're talking a little bit about the prospects of the industry. So I think that's really important. But like I said, I wish that there was more people involved, because we're constantly as a community listening to a bunch of idiots that they never had our best interests. They didn't provide any type of solutions or alternatives. And then now, of course, like I said, people are complaining about price or complaining about adoption, complaining about the amount of folks that didn't show up into our community. And we have to understand, we made that choice. You know, we made that choice in 2021 when we were listening to a bunch of dumb fucks that didn't have Pulse Chain, Hex, Richard's best interest, our community's best interest. They were just selfish pricks trying to get rich quick. And that's what they did, you know. And now that they have, since they had no background, no experience, no network with other professionals around the crypto industry, this is what we have now. So we made the decision, like I said, in 2021, by going with the wrong participants. We could have been involved with a lot of people with background in crypto, history, experience. We could have networked with them. We could have built other other bridges, but we decided that we wanted to cloud chase dumb tards, and we have the results. So like I said, it's not it's not set in stone. You know, we can always fix it by modifying our behavior and taking better paths to the goals. Because at least what we've been doing in the last 3 years has not worked. So I hope that people understand that and stop making the same mistakes. Because if not, it's gonna be a tougher way up. All right, so it looks like they'll be back in like 10, 20 minutes. You can just have a quick discussion. So if, like I said, if you're seeing the stream, please share the stream on Twitter. We're trying to make this channel go viral. That makes sense. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be providing a little bit more info on what we're doing with the Pulse Chain Foundation, the different numbers and items that you're going to need in case you want to donate and receive the tax benefit. So I know that for a while there, I was a little bit doubtful if we were going to do that. I know that a lot of people in the community were telling me, just let's go, let's do it, and we'll just provide the information to the community, and they'd get to decide, you know, who wants to donate or not. We'll try to go more for type of government grants is, I think, my top priority at this point. That way we're not using funds from the community or community members to grow our platform, our message, or our reach. We can just use some of the tools that are available, and that should be, we should be discussing this in the next couple of days or weeks, because I want to make sure that it's happening. Not many people decided to take the time or the effort, and of course, when we see it now, when we go to some of the spaces, they're not focused on education. They're more focused on TA or price go up type of stuff. And to me, that's just not that important. I prefer to cover this type of discussion, and that way we can figure out, oh, this is the type of proposals they're coming up with. This is what they're mentioning. This is how they're fixing some of the issues. Maybe this is how we we bridge that gap, right? But we got to be careful, because some of the panelists they're talking about a lot of TradFi conversation, TradFi regulation, and how do we make crypto fit into that? And I don't think that's the right approach at all. Like it's a bit disappointing how they continue to mention and incentivize that talk of how do we make DeFi fit into 1930 securities laws. And it shouldn't be that way at all. You know, they need to figure out how this new technology gets regulated instead of how this new technology fits into the old system. Okay, so I wish that they would correct that, but sadly it doesn't happen that way. And we're seeing that most of the people that continue to lobby and continue to send money into Washington, like Coinbase and JP Morgan and other big institutions, they're not going to have the same goals that we do, right? They're not going to want the same for DeFi. They're going to want it more regulated, or they're going to want it in different ways that we don't. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. We'll wait for the roundtable here to start in the next 10 minutes. And see what kind of conversation comes up out of this. I'll try to clip a few things and then we'll talk about them on Spaces. But like I said, I don't like that these type of topics get ignored all the time and then later people will just kind of complain, almost like what happened with Hex. Like the rules that have been applied in November of 2021 and early 2022, like that executive order from March of 22, we had discussed it. We went to main chat, we went to some of the influencers streams. We try to tell folks, hey, this is what's going to happen with DeFi and this is how you could get affected. And not many people paid attention, but then of course it gave them powers to go and go after Richer in the summer of 23, and then everything that's happened since. Because I don't think that's discussed often. How much we've had to go through at the start of the chain. It was like at the worst possible moment. To get flooded, to get negative publicity, whatever you want to call it. Like I don't think that any of the layer ones that we compare Pulse Chain to went through anything like that. Not ETH, not I think EOS was out already for more than a year before they got their issues. So, but yeah, in the case of Hex, it was like, in the case of Pulse, it was like right away. Like the network launches in May and then right away issues in the summer. So, but yeah, we'll discuss this in the next space.
Around too much more around comments. Lots of
want-
good points of view.
All right. I think we are ready to go. I heard Peter just say, I'm glad we solved it. So we're going to find out in the next hour and 20 minutes or so what exactly we solved and what the it and what the it is here. So anyway, so thanks everybody for continuing with us this afternoon. So as mentioned, we had a number of terrific questions that came in from the audience. We'll fold those in. If you don't hear your exact question posed, it's only because we're kind of weaving it into the conversation. So you may not hear it a word for word sort of way, but we're trying to make sure that we're responsive with the time that we have, realizing we don't have a ton of time, but to the great input that audience members submitted. So just with that, having been said at the outset, as I mentioned, I have a queue that's working, and encourage any and all the panelists just to raise your hand or otherwise catch my attention if you want to get in the queue. But at the same time, I won't be shy about just calling you if I think that you may have something in particular to contribute to whatever was just said or recently said. So with that, let me start with Omid.
Yeah, 2 points. First, I thought the disclosure debate was very interesting, and I'm generally pro disclosure. But I think something to be mindful of for all potential DeFi regulations is that they impose a cost, and that those costs really matter, particularly for entrepreneurs. If you spend enough time in crypto, you start seeing everything through the lens of incentives. And like going back to the point that Gabe was making about Apple making disclosures, if I was the CEO of a large public corporation, I would want there to be very strict and very expensive disclosure requirements. Because one, it gives me an opportunity to show off what I'm good at. But two, just the cost of complying creates a moat that prevents entrepreneurs from competing with me. Because if I'm an entrepreneur, I might like disclosures because I want to show off, but with deference to my securities lawyers friends here, I might not be able to afford paying someone to help me make those disclosures. And one of the things that to me makes DeFi very special is because public blockchains are this very special kind of infrastructure that does the heavy lifting. The opportunity for entrepreneurship is vast, and that has not been true in financial services for a very long time, even with fintechs. And I'm not just talking about just the regulatory capital requirements. Just like the cost of doing anything has always been high, but we already have very successful DeFi protocols where you just have one person or group of people came up with an idea, wrote some code, and now it's handling billions of dollars. So I think it's important to always be mindful that whatever regulations ultimately show up for DeFi, we don't get to the point where the next team of sort of like garage tinkerers say, oh, we have a great idea, but it's going to cost us $20,000 to comply with the disclosure requirements, because then that might mean that they might need to go raise money. And raising money, as we've seen in this industry before, often also creates other incentive problems in terms of like the kind of control that we want to get away from, concentration of ownership that we want to get away from.
Yeah, you could do thresholds like TVL, like, just have certain disclosures at 100 million TVL or whatever. There's ways to handle that.
Okay. Yeah. But I think in general, just to be thoughtful of the fact that what we want is for cost to not be an impediment for future DeFi innovation. And then the other thing I wanted to say is references get made in DeFi a lot of times to the importance of preserving peer-to-peer activity, because that was the original goal of Bitcoin. But most of DeFi, what we understand to be DeFi within the industry, which is this ecosystem of protocols that provide services for trading and lending and so on, is not peer-to-peer. Most of it is peer-to-pool. Proof yet once again that actually historically financial services often organically tends towards intermediation because of operational and capital efficiency. DeFi is that way too. If I want to go and earn yield on a stable coin that I own, I don't want to go find somebody else on a blockchain to lend it to, and much rather deposit into a DeFi pool where the smart contracts then facilitate some kind of a lending function. So I think it would be interesting for all of us up here to then think about how much does the peer-to-pool model fit some of the existing rules for intermediaries, or are we going to need actually brand new rules for pools and protocols?
That's just one quick question follow-up, and then we got Rebecca in the queue. So just I'm going to that point about pool or protocol, and your then related point about intermediaries, activities, what have you. I guess the activities point from earlier today. Could you say a little bit more just to make folks are on the same page in terms of how you think about, or how one thinks about who, I'm going to put this in air quotes, controls, influences, runs, manages, you can think of a whole host of different words, the pool or the protocol, and how that then feeds into or might feed into a determination as to whether or not there is or is not something akin to an intermediary.
So there's a way to design a DeFi solution where nobody controls anything. You could literally just say, here are some lines of code. They have the ability to hold assets, and the code then determines what happens to those assets, whether they're traded for other assets or loaned out or whatnot. And then the code could be written in a way that nobody could ever change it, including, by the way, if something goes catastrophically wrong. Very few protocols are like that, understandably so, because a lot of these are still startups. So they want to have some time and some flexibility to upgrade, to improve, to build product market fit. And what you generally don't want a pool that anybody controls, because that's really is decentralization in name only. If whoever controls the code controls the assets, then it's becoming a lot closer to a custodial solution. So the more pressing question is usually how much the actual humans have control over the protocol. And what kind of control is there? Is it a multi-sig? Is it token-based? Is there voting involved? Is the code written in a way where whatever control could be exercised over it has to be done in a slow way over time, or can it be done tomorrow? So as much as I hate to say this, it's a cliche, but in the future, there's going to be a spectrum for all of this, because I think the market is going to want a spectrum of solutions. I think the market is going to want a spectrum of decentralization. And it's interesting to think about what role regulators could play in making sure that, A, the spectrum exists, and then everybody sort of knows what they're getting from using different solutions.
Yeah, and I'm just going to make a quick comment going back to something I think Gabe had said before, and then Rebecca, I'm going to turn to you. And just, Omid, as you were referring to across the spectrum, one of the challenges, and I think this was something Gabe said, and Gabe, if I got this wrong, you can correct me, was about drawing the lines. Where do you draw the lines? And as simplistic as it is from a regulatory perspective, or legislative perspective, even a judicial perspective, is where do you draw those lines that determine what people can do, lines that determine what people can't do. That's no easy task, because you do that in the context of imperfect information. You never know everything about how everything could in fact play itself out. And you have your policy goals and objectives. Going back to some of Peter's comments, you also have your constraints that you want to operate subject to, whatever those constraints may be. And then you say, all right, well, I'm not going to get exactly perfect given goals, objectives. How do you optimize? So am I willing to be under-inclusive in terms of achieving the goal? Over-inclusive, that over-inclusiveness, under-inclusiveness practical challenge when you're drawing lines that figures out what's within whose jurisdiction and how is this going to be regulated or not, is just it's a practical challenge. It's not a philosophical point. It's a practical challenge. But Omid, what you were saying has particular resonance in terms of just what that means as things play out over time, and they're all different points along the spectrum, as you put it. Rebecca.
Thanks so much. So one of the things, I'll just build on a few of the things that a number of people up here have said, but I get to work with DeFi builders who started in the US and who actually stuck it out the last 4 years, who had many discussions about whether they should leave or not, but were able to build here, and they're very happy that they're here and still building in the US. So in terms of the DeFi and the American spirit question that we're answering today, I'd say at Jito Labs, they are building DeFi and infrastructure with the same principles that have driven American progress in the economic system more generally. So personal liberty, innovation, frontierism. But one of the things that I've taken away from being a lawyer in this space and working with a number of DeFi software developers very early is that you need to understand the technology before you either can give advice about where the law intersects or before you regulate it. And today, I think, is a great step forward. And there have been other agencies in the US that have been having these types of roundtables about DeFi. And I think that those are the most important things we can do right now. The European Commission actually put out a report that was authored by IBM Promontory very recently. And the last thing they said was this part of the industry is not ready for legislation yet. The most important thing we can be doing is convening forums between regulators, policymakers, and industry to really move forward where we understand what the ecosystem is. And notwithstanding the enormous mind share that DeFi has captured to date, it is still 4% of the crypto ecosystem. And I think you can read any regulatory paper that's come out. There is a general consensus that DeFi is not tied to or otherwise integrated into the traditional financial system. So hopefully it'll not take 2 years like Lewis and Clark, but I think we do have some time to figure out exactly the right path forward. I do think that disclosure provides a really good basis to think about what needs to happen and what people should know when they are taking control of their own assets and their own economic activity. But I think the thing that we have to struggle with in the US that people don't have to struggle with elsewhere is that we don't have a single financial regulator. So you have the FCA in the UK, you have other, like BaFin in Germany, and there's one centralized financial regulator. So you could say, okay, we're going to them. But here we are grappling with not just one, not just two, but multiple financial regulators. And so where this disclosure regime should come from, notwithstanding that you're right, Gabe, the SEC has been at the forefront in many ways on the disclosure question. I just think we haven't even addressed the predicate issue here today, which is like, what part of DeFi necessarily falls within the SEC's jurisdiction. I think we could probably have a whole separate day on that. And that probably gets very, very technical, which is, you know, what type of receipt tokens, what do they look like, you know, those kinds of things. But I'm not sure that the SEC necessarily has jurisdiction in such a broad way, unless it's granted to them through other legislation to just say, you have to come up with a disclosure framework for crypto more generally. The other thing that I think is important, and I think that was mentioned during this panel, is much of our financial regulation has grown around the way that financial markets were established or as problems were identified in financial markets. So when you have these conflict of interest laws and you separate certain actors in the derivative space from each other, that came about because there were obvious problems in the derivatives markets when those rules were put together. But the industry in many ways is, I wouldn't say self-regulating yet, but there is organic work being done to mitigate a lot of the risks we talked about. So something like the Security Alliance or SEAL, which a number of people on this panel are involved in, is looking for ways to build organic frameworks to combat illicit financial or other bad activity in crypto. There are other projects in the space that are thinking of solutions to allow for more traditional assets to trade within DeFi or on-chain. Michael mentioned that Sonny Kulikov was here, who is the founder of the Aave protocol, which I would say is one of the most important, if not the most important, DeFi protocol in the space. It is also highly decentralized in terms of not having control, whether it be in its DAO over the protocol or things like that. But back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we did try to architect something called Aave Arc, which was like an institutional grade DeFi. And there were ways of finding how to get people to come into work in a DeFi system. And I have heard much of that coming back around. So everything old is new again in terms of how we are trying to put forward proposals. But in terms of DeFi, the industry is working together now. It may not all be, talked about every day, all day on crypto Twitter. That seems to be something where people are talking about other things, but I think the work is being done. And so the most important thing the SEC can do, whether it's within their jurisdiction or not, is to continue convening people, whether publicly or privately, to talk about these issues.
So I got Michael Mosier, I got Kevin, then I got Michael Jordan. But Rebecca, before I come to Michael Mosier, I want to ask you a kind of a specific question within all of that. So if you think about the SEC, one of the notable regulatory regimes and regulated entities are broker-dealers. So without getting into all the nuts and bolts, unless folks want to at some point, around broker-dealers and broker-dealer regulation and what have you, which has a variety of different components to it. Just when you think about broker-dealers and the market function they serve, in the context of DeFi, is the concept of a broker-dealer just outdated, or does it still, maybe not by the label broker-dealer, but by the kind of fundamental function that a broker-dealer serves, still have kind of currency within the context of DeFi?
I mean, that's actually a slippery slope, even if you didn't mean it to be, because I think there has been so much discussion about whether website interfaces that provide information about what is happening on chain with respect to a DeFi protocol is a broker, right? And so I think the term broker dealer is extraordinarily loaded when it comes to DeFi, but I'd go back to what I think a number of people talked about when we started this panel, which is our SEC regulations and actually all of our financial services regulations are predicated or focused on persons. And the way persons is defined is through natural persons or various types of entities. I think we can also probably go down a path about whether certain types of entities in crypto that may look different or may look decentralized, whether they're actually captured in that definition. But putting that side argument aside, I think that in a true or genuine DeFi protocol, you will not have the type of intermediation that will bring the concept of broker dealers back in. And I think, various types of front ends, website interfaces, UIs, whatever you want to call them, which are the normal websites you would go to look at, maybe you can, connect your wallet, do not perform the same functions as broker dealers unless there is serious off-chain activity that is not disclosed, where there may be elements of control that you're not otherwise aware of.
So A, it's about the activities, and B, it's about the details. Is that a fair summation?
I feel like that's a great lawyer answer. So yes, I think the one other thing I didn't say with respect to Gabe's, and I got a lot of, you guys seem to agree a lot when we were out getting ice cream. So I'll say to Gabe, I think the disclosure question then comes down to who's doing it for how long, right? Because not to pick on Aave, and I don't mean, I mean in a positive way, it's so decentralized, is the DevCo, who may be doing some GitHub commits here and there, but is otherwise off building other things, responsible for continuing disclosure? Because then we really are regulating software developers. And I would say that's not anybody's goal.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, well, look, we have a draft legislation in Congress right now that talks about, system maturity, right? And disclosure obligations potentially ceasing or being reduced at that point or changing in some way. So I do think there's a point where these systems can mature and become so decentralized and so autonomous that truly, there's no natural focal point for that disclosure. But I would still sort of say that those systems are supported by various types of secondary actors that, depending on the context, it may be interesting to get disclosure from. So, an example in the Aave context would be liquidation bots, people running liquidation bots or things like that. There was, I mean, it doesn't really apply to Aave because it's actually good and they're good actors. But, in Terra, there was the Labs company. It had created the blockchain. It created various DeFi protocols on the blockchain. It ran the wallet related to the blockchain, and it ran the RPC nodes that the wallet feeds into. And there was a great expose, which unfortunately has been memory hold, it's no longer on the internet, about how these things interacted to give them a systemic advantage in liquidations on their own DeFi protocols, and they were raking in profits. So that's a massive conflict of interest, right? Because and in fact, liquidations on their DeFi protocol were particularly punitive. and they were also running these liquidation bots. So it's the kind of thing that people would want to know. So it is.
But that's a highly centralized system you're talking about.
No, it was not highly centralized. As a blockchain, it was a completely normal blockchain.
But calling Terra DeFi, I think, is maybe one step too far because there was so much control. And so I think that, I agree with you in that instance that where you have these centralized actors who otherwise are controlling an entire.
But they weren't centralized.
They called themselves decentralized.
I know what they call themselves.
The point is, it's about how you define centralization or decentralization. I'm saying you can take a lot of elements that are decentralized in and of themselves. The blockchain was decentralized. The DeFi protocols were just smart contracts, blah, blah, blah. But if you add up a lot of vertical integration in a particular player, I don't know whether you call that centralization or you just call it vertical integration or concentration of risk. But at that point, that particular player becomes, in effect, a trusted entity, even within these otherwise independently trust minimized systems. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. But I guess the question is, what's the limiting principle and when what the legislation
to figure that. I mean, I can't define that right now, but okay. I'm confident you could draw those lines in some reasonable way. We could find a way.
We need more ice cream.
I think we're going to come back to a lot of this as the conversation goes. So I had Joe now in the queue, but Michael Mosier.
I think part of it, just some of this, it might be at least taken from a FinCEN perspective and OFAC actually, going back to something Omid said about it's going to be a spectrum. I mean, I think part of it is looking at things from a FinCEN perspective. It was, is it total independent control? Like, we know that there's going to be measures of centralization, decentralization. It's not so much about whether it's a centralized, decentralized, whatever it is. Is there an element of control? What's the activity and who has control over it? And so thinking of it, and some of that is just basic commercial terms of if tort and commercial implied warranties of who has the ability to stop something bad from happening that was reasonably foreseeable. So I think some of the, like for instance, self-hosted wallets, we looked at multi-signature self-hosted wallets and said, you could be a software developer of this. And in fact, you could even be a holder of a key of a self-hosted wallet. But if you don't have total independent control, then you are not a money service business that is actually accepting and transmitting. And so I think some of these activities that we're looking through here, including the pools that Omid's talking about, there's questions of, number one, okay, who has control over this pool? And that control is what are the activities? The activities could be the ability to let somebody into the pool, or it could be the ability to pause the pool if there's a cyber incident or a code incident. And that's where also we want that spectrum that's really important, because you don't want to disincentivize people from being on a security council, for instance, that if there is a technical and operational risk that folks have described, you want them to be able to vote in that context and say, I'm pulling the emergency brake without taking on liability that you are now a broker dealer or a money service business. And we dealt with this a lot at OFAC, the sanctions arm, because there was a period where there was so much disconnect between Iranian sanctions in Europe and Iranian sanctions in the US, and American business people didn't want to be on boards of multinational companies, but we didn't want to disincentivize people from being on a board who had great judgment, and some had very technical skills like a security counsel. And we want people to be able to vote. And actually we see this daily in legal practice, where people are technical experts in security and are nervous about being on a security council to actually find and make the judgment call that's really just a pause, because they're worried, if it turns out to be Lazarus in hindsight, have I committed a sanctions violation? If the SEC determines that this pool is trading securities, am I part of violating securities laws? And so I think if we look back at what are the types of activities and the types of control, then we might be able to create that spectrum that's more about, okay, you have the ability to initiate, stop, indefinitely deny, or divert value. Maybe you have the different regulatory obligation. But if it's more in an FTC, FCC, you're just part of an implied warranty, maybe that's just reasonable, foreseeable, and it's a much more limited, so that people will serve on security councils.
So I'm gonna go to Kevin next in the queue, but just real quick, if I can, Michael, ask a quick follow-up very quickly. So in terms of you zeroed in on control. From your perspective, is control as relevant as you suggest? Because with control, you can drive, influence, maybe even determine, I'm going to use a broad word, kind of outcomes. Or, and maybe it's an and, is it because with control, that may give rise to conflicts of interest, kind of principal agent problems, agency costs, agency problems, which are often, in kind of broad terms, what regulatory regimes are focused on? Is it because with control, you have, by extension of that, control over information, you know things? So if it's a disclosure point, you have the practical ability. Is it other things? What's the salience, in 20 seconds, of control? On the one hand, it seems intuitive, I think, in many instances, but control is not a self-defining concept, nor is how do you measure it, and nor is why do you care about it?
I think actually I would go right in reverse order there. I think it's we have to look back at why do we care about it. So I think a Cisco router controls the communications networks that might be talking and moving trillions of dollars worth of data throughout the world, but we don't consider them an ATM, and we don't subject them to the same regulatory situation that we would a regulated entity that can control how value is transmitted, even if it going down causes an issue. AWS going down causes all sorts of problems in the financial economy writ large, but we don't consider them a financial institution. And so I think it's looking back, okay, why do we care? We care not because there's a broad general impact and there's probably a critical infrastructure issue around cloud services, but they're not able to individually target a transaction and divert it or initiate it in a way that goes back to consumer protection on some level. Like, would this person reasonably have a tort or an implied warranty that they should have be able to take action from? And then I think from a regulatory perspective, is this something where that person, we don't really think they're going to reasonably be able to take that action, and we need to make sure that there's some sort of parameters to protect them around it.
Kevin.
Yeah, that's a great jumping off point. I think the issue of control is central. It's not just central in DeFi. It's also the question why should we not be so concerned that a terrorist organization might be operating a Bitcoin node and mining because they don't have control over the transactions that are going on top of the network. This relates back to something I wanted to point out that Rebecca said early on, and then we just, I think, glossed over, and I don't think we should, which is the issue of custody. And what she said was non-custodial is, I believe, a non-negotiable element for something being DeFi. I would tend to agree, and I think that's something that is simple and straightforward that the SEC could help in terms of defining out. There's a lot of things we need to talk about in terms of how to draw these lines. I pointed out in part because I don't think there's necessarily broad awareness of that. Maybe there's just agreement on this group. I don't think necessarily, but I'm co-chair of what's called the Global Futures Council on DeFi for the World Economic Forum. And this element of non-custodial was a piece of the definition that the earlier report had included in DeFi. And we had a discussion about it a couple weeks ago, and this was the most controversial topic, that there were a lot of participants in this group, which is a diverse international group of experts in relevant areas, were pushing back on whether something can be custodial and still DeFi. And Mike, I think, gave a great example that a lot of the harms that we are concerned about and that regulation exists to address come about when there are actors who have custody and have that control. There's other kinds of harms. It's not all the harms. So I think that's a straightforward one. And that leads to the second thing I wanted to say briefly, which is something we haven't talked about at all yet, which is stablecoins. Stablecoins, I would say, are not DeFi, but stablecoins are essential to DeFi because you need money on chain, and therefore you can't directly use fiat. And stablecoins have both enabled DeFi and been enabled by DeFi, but the largest stablecoins by far are custodial. And in all likelihood, if the legislation passes in the U.S., the only legal stablecoins in the U.S. will be custodial. And so I think that raises some questions that's partly, potentially a challenge to the DeFi model. It's partly an opportunity that some of the issues we may be concerned about, like illicit finance or some of the issues in terms of being able to stop transactions, maybe could happen at the stablecoin level as opposed to in the DeFi protocols. But there are also stablecoins that are non-custodial, not even algorithmic, but either over-collateralized stablecoins or strategy-based stablecoins like Athena. So I think this is something that needs to be in the conversation. Last thing I'll say really quickly is I think there's also an opportunity and a value in regulators doing some scenario planning about where might this go. We've heard a lot here about the value of DeFi, and Jill gave a very great example about the success of DeFi in the environment after the collapse of FTX. There's reason to believe that this is a better way to do digital asset trading, and that if it gets regulatory clarity, that it could dominate the marketplace. And I think it's worth thinking about what that means in terms of operation of securities laws. It's also possible if tokenization of equities and other securities can happen on digital asset platforms, that DeFi could come to dominate all capital markets. And therefore, we should think about what that means. And that doesn't mean regulate it as traditional securities trading ahead of that happening, but it means not sticking our heads in the sand and not sketching out what that could look like and what might be responses to that. And I think now's the time to start asking those questions and doing those scenario plans.
So Kevin, so just to pick up on that, and then I'll get to Michael J, and then Joel and Peter. But Kevin, just to pick up on that piece, can you say a little bit about two opposing scenarios as you see, realizing that it depends upon a whole host of things and how they play themselves out. But just the kinds of things that you contemplate is, hey, if that happened, that may be in the good bucket. If this other thing happened, that may be in the not so good bucket.
Well, let's, one scenario is at some point in time, the dominant share of, maybe, all securities, but, major asset classes will happen on DeFi platforms. And, one way to interpret that is great. We now have a technological solution to many of the problems that cause the need for regulation. One way of looking at that is we've now basically eliminated all of securities regulation without thinking we were doing so, thinking we were not imposing rules where they don't necessarily apply, and yet the problem still exists. So I think it's an interesting and important empirical question. How many of the problems can be addressed and what can we look to as these markets grow? And it goes back to what I said before. Again, that starts with identifying what are we worried about? Are we worried about financial crime? Are we worried about investor protection? Are we worried about other sorts of things, systemic risks of system failure through interacting agents? And the reason to ask those questions is not because we want to say, oh, there's a risk, so therefore we should stop it, but because we want to back out, there's a risk. How big is the risk? What can be done about the risk? How do the rules address the risk? What are the pros and cons? What are the harms that those rules cause? So again, it's just going through that exercise, but not doing it based on the way the world looks today. It's starting from certain endpoints about how the world may look tomorrow.
Michael Jordan.
Awesome. Our goal for being here today as investors is to improve our market that we invest in. And one thing that we struggle with that we'd love feedback on is how to do forward statements in this context. A lot of what we do is invest in early stage technology companies. They make representations to us and to the market about what they're going to deliver. It's very hard to hold them accountable for that in this context. It's hard to underwrite an asset when you can't predict its future. And when you have a live token of an instant price, how do you then hold the people who issued it accountable for delivering the forward statements they're making? It's a very complicated thing. This is not actually an easy problem to solve. And it's only going to get worse. If what you're seeing from the other asset managers in the world of bringing private illiquid securities to retail investors, the amount of information asymmetry in private markets, technical complexity and nuance required to underwrite the security is going to create a massive issue for people trying to underwrite what's happening today, what statements have been provided, and how do we hold people accountable to those statements.
Gabe, it looks like you were looking at.
Sure. I mean, this isn't an unusual, a new problem in securities law. Just to be clear, there's been a long. If you look at every SEC disclosure statement, there's something called a forward-looking statements disclaimer at the bottom, right? And so there's rules around that. But what I would say is you're allowed to disclaim certain forward-looking statements in securities disclosures, and you're supposed to say, hey, these are forward-looking statements, but it may not work out, and blah, blah, blah. And generally, people are not liable for that under the securities laws. It's actually a corporate governance problem. So you as an investor, right, when you invest in something, instead of just doing a SAFT and these lightweight things that have virtually no rights for you, you should be investing in proper corporate governance structures at the early stage, pre-TGE, pre-network, whatever. And at the later stage, you should be insisting upon things like boards, things like foundations that don't just say, hey, no one knows anyone if you do fiduciary duties or disclosures, and you could do whatever you want, basically, as long as it somehow relates to a certain token. And instead, have those be more exact and give yourselves information rights and other rights over these organizations in the long term. So personally, I think this is not a problem to be solved by the securities laws or by the government. It's to be solved by really good investors who have leverage over projects, contracting with those projects for good rights. And for some reason, I don't understand it, because I'm a corporate governance guy. Originally, I was in M&A. Crypto investors don't do this. They're very, very reluctant to actually have governance rights over the things they invest in. But you can solve this as an investor.
Well, first of all, I think that most crypto investors, you can keep me honest if not.
Every single time.
Well, but I would say they don't want to be, never wanted to be part of these corporate governance structures because the risk was so great in the United States. So, right, like even projects that I was representing would beg for their lead investor to be on the board, and they would say, no, I don't want to do it because I don't want to get a subpoena. They got subpoenas anyway. So that's one. But I do tend to agree with Gabe that this is a contracting problem on the forward-looking statements in terms of what people may say to you in their pitch and then what you actually get in terms of contractual rights. Because you're talking about it, and I'm like, well, if you relied on that, then you have a contract claim. But to Gabe's point, if you don't have that within your contractual rights, you may not be able to do anything about it.
Yeah, to try to get to the market fairness point, investors that have not spoken to the team do not have a lot of this information, to be fair. There is significant market asymmetries that cause price distortions. That's what we're trying to resolve. Every term sheet I've ever given has had these type of control requirements in them, and we have them in many, but this thing becomes a live, dynamic, decentralized network if designed correctly. And there are things that happen that are not public on-chain and high resolution to the market for it to price incorrectly. It needs the ability to communicate about the present and future representations in a safe and transparent way to not disadvantage retail investors so that venture capitalists and other people with more information have edge.
So I'm going to come to Jill next, but just Michael, just to stick with you for one quick follow-up. So to get very specific on that and that point, is the suggestion from your perspective that assuming the SEC has jurisdiction, right? That's a whole separate question, right? Whether or not some security transaction, whatever. But let's just assume they do for purposes of this question. Is your suggestion that in a very specific, focused way, the SEC mandate certain disclosures under the federal securities laws that are fit for purpose for what you're describing?
This is not meant to be a suggestion. It's meant to be highlighting a very complicated market distortion that we are thinking through as risk underwriters today. And we'd like to improve the quality of the market by having these forward guidance disclosed in a sane and fair, equitable way.
Got it. And then just to circle back to Gabe real quick, and then I'll come to Jill. I guess the question for you is there a particular something that you think from a disclosure perspective would be, above all else, again, assuming jurisdiction on the SEC's part, this is something that you think should be required to be disclosed in the context of certain, DeFi?
Yeah, I mean, it's material agreements among material players. I mean, that's about the most succinct way I could play it. Market makers who are have a systemic role in the industry, they should be disclosing their agreements with particular projects, all these things. I mean, I agree, it's partly an investor quality control thing. It partly could be helped with disclosure, but it can't just be to Rebecca's point. It can't just be only on developers, because there's all these secondary players that are relevant, and the exchanges and all these things. And if you get good disclosure, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and the whole market would be better informed.
Got it. I mean, there are interesting questions. Maybe we'll come back to this as we play through, which is on anything along those lines, what is the SEC's jurisdictional hook, right? Because a lot of the discussion is about, technology, if you will, code.
All of these systems are going to have securities in them. I would argue almost all of them already do have securities in them. They're all going to have securities in them, right? So, I mean, ideally, it would be something that Congress passes, right? And I think this will happen sooner or later, right? Or it could be some cooperation between the SEC and the CFTC. But in reality, I mean, I think vast majority of these systems, sooner or later, if not already, are going to have securities in them for whatever it's worth.
I imagine folks may want to chime in on that. So anyway, if you do, catch my attention. But Jill, I wanted to go to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll stay on topic here because I think this is a great conversation about accountability, disclosures, and risk mitigation. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that the industry has not waited for regulators and overseeing bodies to chime in on this. This is something I'm really proud of as a participant in the industry, is that industry has done an excellent job, I would say, of self-regulating and self-policing, in particular over the last 5 years. And I'll give a quick example of one of each of those on accountability, disclosure, and risk, respectively. On accountability, we see projects get taken over by their communities. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen where we have on-chain governance systems. Token holders have a vote in the direction of the project, in particular in the way that funds get spent by a project. This is all transparent, enforceable on-chain. And we see communities, from the perspective probably of the founders of these projects, go rogue on them, where they say the founders aren't delivering what they said they would deliver. Those forward-looking statements were indeed bogus, and we're going to take the project in a different direction. This cuts both ways, but I think that it, taken the right way, is a positive development in terms of self-regulation by the industry. An example on the disclosure front is a website and a team called L2Beat. So in the Ethereum ecosystem today, you have all of these different chains. It's no longer a monolith, as we talked about earlier. You have all of these layer 2 chains. And so L2Beat, i.e. layer 2 beat, I encourage everyone who has their phone or laptop out, go to l2beat.com. It's an incredible dashboard and repository in which an independent team has created their own framework that has made it incredibly legible, even for new users, to come in and understand the risks associated with and the levels of decentralization associated with any of these apps or chains. And I think that that is a great example of self-regulation, self-policing by the industry. And if you're going to wade in and create disclosure rules, you have to talk to the people behind that project, and you have to look at that website before you get started. Yes, there's one for DeFi as well. That's a great point, Gabe, DeFi Beat. The third example I'll give of self-regulation, self-policing just happened last week. So we've talked a lot about the risks of decentralization on this roundtable this afternoon. One of those risks is that there's no recourse. If something is truly decentralized, if you send money to the wrong address, there's no chargeback. You're not getting it back. There was an instance last week that went somewhat viral on crypto Twitter. Someone had used a piece of software built by a great company called Gnosis, not realizing that they were using a legacy version of it, sent their entire net worth to the wrong address that they thought was associated with themselves, but in fact was not. They thought that a black hat hacker had been squatting on that address, just waiting for them to do it. And within a matter of hours, it became apparent that, in fact, it was not black hats. It was a white hat group called Protofire that had been squatting on that address, foreseeing that this could be a possibility for folks in that situation using the legacy bit of software. This was all disclosed, by the way, ahead of time by Gnosis. But to Eric's point earlier, we don't all read the fine print, but the white hats got the entire net worth of this individual back to him within a few hours. So I just want to highlight, a lot of bad horror stories get told about the way the crypto industry acts and behaves and runs amok in the absence of guidance. But there's a lot of good to be found as well.
So just to pick up on that, and then Peter, I'll come to you. So Jill, in terms of the self-policing and self-governance that you just spoke about and gave examples of, and realizing you're not, I don't believe, looking to overextend the point or go farther than you intend to go. Nonetheless, here's the question. In light of that, and I'm sure other examples like that you could share with us, what's the SEC's role? What do you think of in terms of that balance between self-policing, self-governance versus when the government needs to come in, whether it's the SEC or otherwise, and as to which risks, and I know we could go in a lot of directions and that could get very technical very quickly, regulatorily wise or technology wise, but how to figure out and how to think about that balance.
Yeah. So I'm not a lawyer up here, so you won't hear my thoughts on Lowe versus SEC today, sadly. But I do think from a layman's perspective, I tend to associate the SEC with consumer protection. That's how I think of the SEC's mandate. And that's something that I've been very grateful for at times. And then there have been other times where I have felt like, candidly, the actions of the SEC have been misguided and long-term, in terms of the second order effects, caused more harm than good to consumers, not to me as an entrepreneur, but to consumers of the crypto space and of the industry. And I think that this is where, again, I want to highlight areas in which the industry has made headway on its own in terms of consumer protection. I'm less going to sit here and say the SEC should come in here, should come in there. But I think that there's a lot of lessons actually the SEC can learn from the crypto industry in how best to protect consumers of it.
But the crypto industry could do a lot better too. So I love those examples that you give, but I think too often they are the exception, not the rule. And I bet every single one of us here finds ourselves in situations regularly where we see the crypto industry do something where we just shake our head. And I think the best way to avoid there being the kind of regulations that do disrupt innovation and progress is for the industry to just clean up its act a bit more. Unfortunately, the incentives aren't. Usually the incentives are actually the other way around. I think, Michael, this is what you run into all the time, that there are people making money from doing these shady deals behind the scenes, but we as an industry could do a better job of policing our own.
Peter.
So I'm going to start by diving back to something that we abandoned a little while ago, but I'll bring it back to this current conversation. Not low versus SEC, more First Amendment. No, Mike Mosier brought up the control question. And I'm happy to highlight this today because yesterday in a new version of the Clarity Act in the House, we got an introduction of language from Rep. Torres and Rep. Emmer's original Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which is a piece of legislation that's intended to clear up the question of whether you're a money transmitter and therefore subject to unlicensed money transmission liability, as are the developers of the Tornado Cash Protocol and the Samurai Wallet, which have both been prosecuted in the Southern District of New York. That law is very important because, well, FinCEN in 2019, Mike knows quite well, said you're not a money transmitter if you don't have control, total independent control over customer funds. And it's important to create that bright line rule in that context because of the gravity of the penalties that someone will face for breaking that rule, and because of the low burden of proof for culpability that a prosecutor faces when they bring that action. Because this is not a money laundering prosecution. This is not you knew that you were helping this person evade the law or hide their money. This is you were doing something that we define a certain way and you never registered with us. And that's basically a strict liability criminal felony then. You just need, the only thing the jury gets to decide is whether you registered or not, which is quite simple. And so the legal question of who is on the hook to register or not is the whole game, and therefore you need a crisp standard so people know what side of the strict felony liability they're on. And that's why in, say, anti-money laundering, Bank Secrecy Act contexts, where registration or licensing is required, that's the standard I want. That does not mean that that's the full and total and end and be all of where we have regulatory obligations or not. That's already not the case. Someone who doesn't have control and is primarily engaged in the publication of software could be prosecuted by the FTC or the CFPB for unfair deceptive acts and abusive acts for the CFPB practices when the software that they've published harms other people and they were manifestly negligent in the way that they published or described that software. That also doesn't violate our First Amendment principles inherently because it's not a prior restraint on speech. It's penalties for doing harm with speech after you've published. It's not a Bureau of Censorship, it's a reasonable liability regime as we have for things like defamation. And so I think what we're getting at, one of the things we're getting at here is that there are a lot of other categories beyond I have control or not, where someone has made assurances to their users in technical documents or maybe in user interfaces or more intelligible for the ordinary person areas where the users have come to rely on those assurances. Maybe it's an implied warranty, maybe it's some sort of cause of action and negligence, and we want there to be some guardrails in place there. Now, the interesting question is, what is the role of the SEC there? Because a lot of that could be done using existing fraud or even just basic negligence torts. And that might be the right way to do it, because when you have that freedom to sort of have plaintiffs' attorneys construct their theory of liability. I mean, let's just go back to 1L law school. Duty, breach, cause, damages. make a case that they had all of those. They had a duty because of the way they present themselves to consumers. Everyone assumes that they're going to act in a certain way. They breached that duty. The escape hatch was supposed to be triggered when condition Y materialized, and it didn't materialize. They caused it. That was actually the reason that someone lost funds. And there's damages that are quantifiable. So they're not just speculative, where you could just basically use this as a sledgehammer to kill all innovation by always claiming that eggshell skull rules aside. That's a flexible system. And I like that. Now, why aren't we there with DeFi now? There are actually some really hard topics that maybe we don't even want to air on this panel right now. For one, even developers of fairly centralized projects that are not custodial will disclaim that they are any kind of incorporated organization. And they'll say, well, it's a DAO. You can't sue the group. We can't be jointly and severally liable because we're a DAO. We're not individuals working together to profit off of the common management of a thing. So that's a really thorny question. We need to look at the Uki DAO private action, the CFTC suit, for ways that we can find a way through that really thorny question. I'm from a civil liberties organization. So you might say, like, Peter, why are you talking about DAOs being jointly and severally liable? Well, the fact of the matter is, I'm less afraid of that kind of liability than failure to register liability, because there will be a showing in court. There will have to be proofs of duty breach, depending on the cause of action. And this is how we actually grope towards an idea of what kind of standards do we want to have in place in the space. And it's done in retrospect rather than some legislature thinking like, oh, I can figure out exactly how all these things should be built ex ante. Why we're not there, I think, is partially incumbent on us, but it's also because there's been this terror of using existing private law to form your organization. Because God forbid you actually incorporate or even have a document that says you're all interested in working together on a thing, because then you'll get slapped with failure to license as a money transmitter, and you get arrested at 5 a.m. and prosecuted for a strict liability federal felony. Similarly, with the SEC's highly aggressive approach towards token issuance in the former chairmanship, I think there were a lot of people who thought, like, I don't want to look anything like a possible fiduciary to my co-developers, because I'm mostly worried about unregistered securities issuance, a sort of a failure to check in, rather than the liability for disappointing my co-founders, because I should have been treated as a fiduciary in some regards to them, and I wasn't.
There's also, I mean, just quickly on the tort thing, there's also the economic loss doctrine, and so
it's a favorite of mine. Yeah,
the cases that have been brought, like the MakerDAO Black Thursday thing, I'm pretty sure that was dismissed out of hand on that basis. So it's tough. It's tough.
Well, and an interesting question as to the SEC's role here is, are there areas where the SEC can help us define what negligence per se is? And is there any jurisdiction under the SEC for those things that are relevant to securities transactions to obviate the economic loss doctrine, to say, actually, in this case, you don't need to prove physical harm to the plaintiff. You can just cite economic damages. These are approaches that I would be very interested in having conversations about, because we actually would start working towards more nuanced bottom-up legal solutions as the common law can typically deliver, rather than trying to reason in a vacuum about who's going to have to come in and register and not.
Michael J.
Yeah, Rebecca was earlier talking about a project called Aave Arc. Galaxy, my former employee, was one of the first design partners. And the reason it didn't get off the ground the way we hoped was everyone had to check if it was okay with compliance. And by compliance, I mean everyone at the bank or whatever asset issuer it was. And the point of the story is that the SEC can help us get real people with real risk teams involved by making sure people are understanding what's happening, what's appropriate and what's not. It was 100x more work to get Aave Arc off the ground than the other projects we were doing, even though we were doing 10x better risk mitigation than anyone else in the industry was. And so we were being penalized for trying to work with real people in a very safe way. And so when we're thinking about practical things we could take away from this, it's not that all action or inaction is a help. It is making sure that the stance of people is, hey, we want to work. We want the real participants to come in with real risk departments and help you grow.
Just to key off of Michael's point, just to go back to Aave Arc, because everything old is new again. I think one place actually the SEC could put out really helpful rules, because I don't think the only reason it didn't get off the ground was for checking with compliance. For sure, that was part of it. But the permissioning of the system, there was a collective action problem on the permissioning for entrance into the system. And so to Gabe's point, if we are going to have, or if we already have securities trading on DeFi protocols, I'd say, at least I wouldn't say broadly, but in certain instances, we know that there are securities, at least in permissioned pools on certain DeFi protocols. What the SEC can do is should talk about the permissioning or the whitelisting standards of the people who are going to let people into those systems, right? So when we were thinking about Aave, it was like, well, are your standards of KYC or whitelisting the same as ours? And can we let that other person in and things like that? And so I think that would solve the collective action problem of what do you need to do to allow someone into a permissionless system where securities are or might be traded.
So I'm going to go to Peter, and then Eric, I want to come to you.
And ideally, we can do a lot better than the existing permissioning done by the financial institutions, because right now, when you want to open an account, you have to submit your passport photo, your mother's maiden name, all kinds of absurd private information. And yet, scammers and bots still get through those filters while innocent Americans are just struggling to open an account. So we have a lot of great tools in our space. There's a verifiable credential standard that's actually predates cryptocurrency, just for passportable digital identity. Now, you can do a lot better than just, I can prove that I have a digital signature on my passport that I've put onto my phone, if you can aggregate multiple credentials in some sort of user sovereign wallet. At the end of the day, there ends up being some certain metadata and other aspects of aggregating all those credentials that might have to be held on a server somewhere, but it shouldn't be a server. It shouldn't be Google or Apple that knows all of the different identity documents you have, and your diploma on your wall, your driver's license in your wallet. It should be a freaking blockchain, and it should be completely private, like some of the newer layer 2s like Aztec, or some of the newer layer 1s like Aleo. And then you can use zero knowledge proofs as the individual who holds the credentials to selectively disclose to the entity out there who's only supposed to deal with, gated securities transactions, that you are, i.e., an accredited investor. But that entity doesn't need to know anything else about you if we get this right. And there's a huge work stream in digital identity that is waiting to be explored right at the same time that we're thinking about how to, well, not right at the same time, because we were trying to do it a while ago with Aave, but everything old is new again. But right at the same time, it's new again. It's new again. So I think these two things work absolutely in tandem, and that's one of the most promising areas for the SEC to do good work in this space, is figuring out better ways of gating and permissioning that aren't just this, give us all of your personal information in order to get onto this platform.
Gating and permissioning where the SEC itself leverages the capabilities of the technology.
Exactly.
So not just that the technology creates certain risks, but that it creates certain opportunities aside from what it means in terms of peer-to-peer, peer-to-pool, peer-to-protocol, but it creates other opportunities in terms of compliance, risk management, and the like.
I mean, not only should a bank not need to know what race I am for me to open an account, they should not know what race I am. Period. Ever. Why? There's no point for it.
Eric, so we've talked about a lot of stuff. It would be great to get your thoughts, whatever they may be, on what we've been talking about since after the break.
I want to suggest that what we see in front of us is actually a really remarkable flourishing of new financial innovation. I want to point out how well the markets are actually solving the problems that have emerged in crypto. For those of you who have been in crypto long enough, you remember Mt. Gox, right? The big exchange, centralized exchange that blew up, almost destroyed the whole industry. What regulation prevented that from happening? Or what regulation from government came out that solved that problem in the future? None, not a single one. You know what did solve it? DEXs, decentralized exchanges, solved that problem because you had open source immutable code that anyone could see. That is a amazing market innovation that does not get enough airtime. I want to point out, let's use Aave again, versus a company like BlockFi. BlockFi was based in New York, and BlockFi abided by all the rules and all the regulations, and much of their marketing was based around how compliant they were. They made sure to KYC all of their customers. They made sure that everyone that worked with them had to hand over their private personal information. And meanwhile, Aave did not. Aave was this, Wild West DeFi application. What was the future of these two things? Aave is still around and processes billions of dollars trustlessly in an amazingly transparent way. BlockFi went bust and lost hundreds of millions of dollars of customer money, right? Which regulation solved that problem? None. It was DeFi, it was private markets and people pursuing profit to solve problems, which Americans used to realize was something that the market is supposed to do, not the government. I want to point out that as far as the SEC goes, I want to draw people's attention to what crypto looked like pre-2017 and post. Pre-2017, nearly all of the innovations that we enjoy in crypto happened. This included things like the DEXs and the liquidity pools, the NFTs, which started with CryptoKitties way back then. We had permissionless lending platforms. We had distributed file storage systems. We had Ethereum itself, smart contracts, which are one of the most remarkable financial innovations of all time. We had privacy coins. Everything was booming in 2017. Admittedly, there was lots of fraud and nonsense, as happens on all frontier markets and all speculative cycles. And yet, when 2017 came to an end, 2018 arrives and the SEC arrives. And the SEC completely stamped out most of the innovation that was happening in this space. And I was there at the very front lines seeing the souls getting crushed of the entrepreneurs that were trying to do this stuff. Some of them just gave up. Some of them moved to other countries. And what kind of innovations have we had following that regulatory enforcement? We've had L2s and we've had Fartcoin. This is a very important point.
A thing to add in is if you want to talk about like effective distribution of a token, like Ethereum, just doing a public sale to like nerdy interested developers created a really fair distribution. And Jesus, they raised about $35 million to build that. And look at what happened after people started doing regulatory compliant token issuance. Venture capitalists get all of the tokens and the project kind of withers on the vine despite having massive funding.
Yeah, post 2018, most of the interesting token sales went through more regulated channels, and the VCs were the ones that made out.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all this 100%. It's definitely a factor, but there are other variables beyond just regulation. Like when people bought into the Ethereum ICO, like no one was confident that these things were worth billions and billions of dollars yet. And if an entrepreneur is raising today, I think many times they don't want to just sell to just anyone. They want to get the VCs because there are certain advantages. So it is complicated. Generally agree with the gist of both of what you said. And it's a factor for sure. And it's part of the story of how we got to the current bad place. But there are other factors for what it's worth.
I don't disagree. I mean, sometimes I've found myself saying something that I will admit is quite naive. Like, just do what Satoshi did. Why do you have to raise money at all? Whoever that person is, they built the most important innovation in the recent history of finance, and they did it with no fundraising. They were able to mine, though, for about 2 or 3 years with no competition, because who in their right mind would start mining Bitcoin in the early days, and who would even know that it was available? Those kinds of early returns on someone's innovation are probably no longer available, because the minute you actually create some new protocol with a proof of work or a proof of stake mechanism, you're going to get out competed of your own innovation and not actually earn.
Green Coin tried a fair launch, right? Proof of work, all the same stuff that Satoshi did, and private equity firms bought off all the miners and dumped the supply and retail really suffered. So it's complicated.
And the SEC certainly doesn't bear the burden of that issue. Yes. But I think it has made it very difficult for folks who are, in good faith trying to do the right thing to take more reasonable steps towards, say, creating some sort of like incorporation between yourselves or being in your U.S. jurisdiction and cooperating with law enforcement and regulators, because you're just so afraid of this. Did you come in and register, or did you get a money transmission license question?
So Eric, I think you now may have some more more to respond to. So if you want to,
I'll just end that little tirade by saying that the entrepreneurial spirit, especially when it comes to anything novel, is an incredibly precious thing. it does not grow in hostile environments, and it cannot be planned for. And it is an impulse that is responsible for much of the wonderful things that we have in the world. America became great because, whether consciously or not, permitted that impulse to happen. And cryptocurrency has been a demonstration of that impulse coming back in specifically the realm of finance. The best thing that America could do for itself, for its people, for the world, would be to embrace that impulse and to permit that kind of permissionless innovation to happen again. And that requires permitting risk, that requires permitting harm. It requires letting people experiment without a permission slip. And if America can do that and lead, then I think most other countries will follow suit. So we'll leave it at that.
So Michael M., any thoughts on any or all of that?
This is going to be very nerdy take on that, but we've done this before a bit in the prepaid cards world. Looking to my regulatory professors to appreciate, but prepaid cards came out actually in the 70s in Europe, but then the 80s and 90s in America. And for a while, in fact, it was Congress that was pushing FinCEN in particular to regulate. They said there's these cards, they're sort of bearer instruments, but they can be, but it mixes with the online. It's online and offline. What do we do with these? We think there's too much risk. And FinCEN basically took a strategic incrementalism for a long time, actually through the 80s and 90s into 2000. In fact, I think it was, I just looked it up. It was in 2009, finally, FinCEN said, we're going to take action. Congress is really pushing us, but we want to be incremental here. They had extreme engagement with industry, really over a couple of decades. And the way they did it was they quantified engaging with industry. What are the major risks here? And working with law enforcement, and then basically set thresholds of activity based on the actual risks that they were seeing, including the ability to, so when you could refill a card, it's a much higher regulatory perimeter. When you can't refill it, when you can only use it in a closed loop system, when you can use it internationally but not domestically, there's all sorts of ways to do it. And I think part of that was getting together with industry and saying, okay, these are the priority risks. To Eric's point, in the meantime, there's a threshold at which we're just going to let people experiment to a certain degree, but we're going to set some priority risks and keep coming down from the priorities, which is actually something that the administration, the last two administrations actually have said repeatedly, even on, especially on illicit finance, is let's prioritize the risks. We can't treat everything the same. So I do think this has been done before, but here there's an opportunity to do it that leverages even more of the technical risk management than we ever had before.
And just to follow up real quick, and then maybe Jill, I'll pose a similar question to you in the 10 or so minutes we have left here for a few more questions. Is one of the risks the risk of stifling the innovation, stifling the technology? I mean, how does that factor? Because you can think about risks in terms of the downside, right? Things that just go badly. You can think about risk in terms of the upside that you lose, and how to weight those things in terms of just the judgments. That goes back to some of the points about line drawing, and goes back to some of Peter's points about, do you have more bright lines so that folks are able to know with certainty? Of course, that then really presents the line drawing question. But if you do it in an informed way, you know that you're making choices. If you have more principles or standards, there's something to be said for that, because there's inherent flexibility. But with that inherent flexibility can come a measure of uncertainty. So you start thinking about the risk, you start thinking about it symmetrically. Losing a good thing is a risk in addition to incurring a bad thing. And then you think about, all right, do you want certainty and clarity and bright lines, even if you run the risk of the line being a little too this or a little too that? You have opportunity to come back and adjust, and at least you have certainty, and folks can comport their business and activities accordingly. Is that the kind of thing, or do you have something else in mind?
I think it is risk and opportunity, and part of that opportunity is that you may miss an opportunity to better manage risk. And so I think that's partly why we talked about safe harbors for white hat hackers. Like Jill gave this incredible example of people that were willing to, that actually came in and saved someone's life savings. in an otherwise very trustless, permissionless system, that the downside of that is you could lose everything if you send it to the wrong address. But you had people that were able to save somebody, but those people are not going to do that the next time if they're considered a financial institution as a money transmitter for doing that, or if they feel overly liable to cyber intrusion risk from the Department of Justice that says this is technically a hack and we're prosecuting you. It doesn't matter to us that the victim may or may not be on board. And there's a lot of that gray area where the white hats are doing. This is something that Security Alliance spent a lot of time. Gabe worked on this, Rebecca, setting out a safe harbor so that people could do exactly what Jill was talking about and save people in a way that, having been at Justice Department, we didn't want every single person that lost $20 coming into us. And we were extremely happy when people would just help each other. There's always plenty of crime. So I think having that sort of ability to, like, that opportunity is the opportunity to keep people from actually helping each other. And that's really important. And I think the last opportunity that I want to highlight that we want to make sure we're factoring in is in the last Trump administration, it was an authoritarian regime in Venezuela, and people were quite sick, and there was no way to get money to these pro-democracy and even just plain healthcare workers in Venezuela. And the way that the government determined to do that, working with the democratic opposition in Venezuela, was they identified healthcare workers in Venezuela that had self-hosted wallets that they could transmit seized funds of the authoritarian dictator that had been frozen and then seized, that they got back to the people of Venezuela who are healthcare workers, only possible in a permissionless system. 60,000 healthcare workers in Venezuela were transmitted to their self-hosted wallets, USDC, in a way that you could never do it. Any fiat currency that the US government sent into Venezuela would just be taken by the central government. And that was a major national security and foreign policy goal of the US that was heretofore absolutely impossible to do other than bags of cash on the tarmac. And who knows where that goes. So I think the opportunity is it's a foreign policy risk, it's a democracy risk, but it's also a risk management risk of that sort of safe harbors.
Got it. So I'm going to, in the 10 minutes we have, I'm going to come to Peter just real quick on a very specific question, then Jill, Kevin, Omid, and then we'll see if we're at.
Could I just like 2 seconds just
Sure,
follow
okay.
up on that? Because you raised a good question, right? It comes down to organizational mission. And if we're talking about the SEC, it has a multifaceted mission. One part of the mission is investor protection, and that should be taken seriously. Another part of the mission is promoting capital formation in the United States. And that's about the opportunity that's lost when there's too much or too harsh regulation. So, I mean, both of these things can be true, and each government entity needs to look to its own mission in terms of making that assessment.
And Peter, the quick question for you, because you had mentioned bright lines and also standards as well. Just I'm curious from your perspective, when you think about all the things you think about, it could be First Amendment stuff, it could just be the practicalities, not just your practicalities of regulation, compliance, et cetera. Do you have a general view in 60 seconds or less in terms of the pros, cons of more bright lined approaches, particularly when it's still relatively early days, which have their certainty, as compared to more principles or standard based approaches, which have their flexibility, but sometimes can have a measure of uncertainty? Do you have a view or a leaning one way or the other on that?
So where people's liberty is on the line, I want a bright line standard. And that's why the money transmission licensing issue is CoinCenter's top priority, and why the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act in Congress is our top priority legislation. Sorry to bring that up at the SEC. It's nothing to do with you all. It has to do with money transmission regulation. But when someone can be found guilty by a jury of a strict liability federal felony for failure to register, I want people to know exactly what kind of conduct they're supposed to register for. I'm also going to say that I don't want certain conduct to be subject to registration, because that could start to become a prior restraint on speech if the thing you're supposed to register for is publishing a software protocol. But on harder questions, like where we have these nebulous concerns about levels of influence or responsibility that people in these systems can use to abuse their users, or can negligently fail to make true their implied promises, their implied warranties, or their explicit promises to their users, I do not think a bright line rule makes sense, because we simply do not know the things we do not know as far as how these systems should be built, what kinds of technological controls should be in place, what kinds of actual agency and discretion for developers or quasi-trusted entities on these networks are good and that we want to see. And so we can't write that as a bright line test. And to me, when I say principles-based regime, I mean the private law. I mean the common law, because that to me is actually the most principles-based, bottom-up, emergent way of lawmaking. I don't think Congress should be taking action, even if it's to create some sort of cause of action that the private law could be used. I think you want the fraud laws to be used. You want misrepresentation. And these are things that are also within the SEC's jurisdiction with respect to their specific powers over securities transactions. So to me, I would just 100 times over-index on that vis-a-vis DeFi. And to the extent there's anything where you want registration and that there are strict liability crimes for registration, that needs to be a bright line category, because we don't want people falling on the wrong side of that line, surprisingly. And that also cannot be something as simple as publishing a software protocol.
Joe, to come back to the question I had asked Michael M., just a broad question in terms of thinking about lost opportunity and how that weighs in the balance. And it's also the point that Kevin commented on. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I mentioned earlier, but I'll just reiterate again, we've lost, both as the United States and also as an industry, a lot of great innovators and entrepreneurs over the last 5 or 6 years. And I really hope that is a point that sticks with those of you who are tuned in or live in the audience here, because that is what is at stake. And I think that we've had a lot of great examples of the potential, but also what crypto has already delivered, mentioned here on the panel today. I would like to see more efforts being put into delivering stablecoins into regions of the world where they're most badly needed. But over the last several years, partly because of the SEC, partly because of other organizations like it, not just in the United States, but around the world, that struck fear into the hearts of a lot of the entrepreneurs who were working on these things. Thankfully, there are those brave few who stuck around and continued to work on these very real products and services. But many were driven, again, out of the country, out of the industry, or as Eric highlighted, into other areas of the industry that, if you ask me personally, are much less productive. The meme coin mania has singularly grown out of SEC's policies over the last 5 years. And that is, regardless of what you think of meme coins, in my view, that is a damn shame, because that innovation and that entrepreneurial fire previously was going into the types of products that Michael mentioned, that MJ mentioned, that Gabe has mentioned. So many of the conversations that we've had up here today have focused on. But that fire has at least in part been lost to, again, in my view, less productive entrepreneurial endeavors over the last few years.
Ahmed.
Since we're nearing the end of the conversation, maybe a question that I don't have the answer to, which is that stablecoin legislation is moving forward. The season freeze function of stablecoins is a key part of that legislation. Stablecoins are very prominent in DeFi. If stablecoin issuers start seizing and freezing coins in DeFi, it'll break DeFi. And I think this is, both Gabe and Kevin sort of alluded to this, that we have permissioned or regulated entities starting to really interact with the more native permissionless ones within DeFi. And it's something we have to start talking about. And so far, the solutions that I've heard are frankly not very good, because they just pit two parts of what the government wants against each other. So, for example, the entities that care about illicit activity want the seize and freeze function. But if you're an agency like the SEC, you really care about the stability of DeFi, and you wouldn't want something like Circle suddenly being compelled to freeze $1 billion USDC in an Aave pool to lead to a run on Aave.
Or what if, to plug into a narrative that was current before, Circle decided to IPO, what if someone new acquires Circle and they happen to run a blockchain that competes with another blockchain where billions of dollars of this stablecoin are. Why are they acquiring it? Are they acquiring it just to run a stablecoin business, or does it give them a hook into their competitor to influence fork choice, which we haven't talked about at all here, but it's a big, big thing, all these things. And, that may be the realm of antitrust. The SEC may have a role, the CFTC may have a role, but the bigger these systems become and the more systemically important they become, the more important these issues and questions of law become.
All right. Well, I think we're at time. I think we could talk a lot more about a lot more stuff, but if you join me in thanking the panelists, and Commissioner Peirce is going to bring some here.
Well, thank you, Troy, and thank you to the panelists. I thought this was a fascinating discussion. It shows we need, we're not done yet, really. There are a lot of unanswered questions still. But I think it is encouraging to know that we can make progress. We talked about sometimes the community in a protocol says to the founder, we're taking it over from here. We're going to do something different. And I think this is a time for the American people to say to its regulators, you know what, you really messed up and we want to take it in a different direction. And so now let's figure out where to go with that. I think there's some promise, there's a lot of risk, I think, that we talked about. Those risks manifested themselves in people leaving the U.S., spending their time on less productive things than they otherwise would have. But there's also promise, I think, in the sense that we as regulators should remember that a lot of problems are problems that we don't have to solve. We just have to give people the room within which they can solve those problems, and then we can focus on the ones that regulators are uniquely designed to solve. And so some of that there is stuff that we can take off our plate, and I think that's encouraging. And then we can all try to do a better job with what's on our plate, and more interactions like this are going to be very valuable for us in that. So Troy, I know you've put in a tremendous amount of work in preparing for both this roundtable and the first one. I appreciate it. We all have lots of work ahead of us. I do invite people who have thoughts on these things to take a look at our website. If you go to the SEC's main website, sec.gov, there's a tab there for Crypto Task Force. There are different ways you can interact with us there. We do welcome people's feedback. You can provide written input. You can come meet with us. And so I'm looking forward to further input from people. I have to thank, before we end, just the dozens of talented and committed commission staff in the chairman's office, other commissioners' offices across the commission, the Office of Information Technology, Public Affairs, Secretary, Chief Operating Officer, Office of Financial Management, and many others. And then on the Crypto Task Force, it's a wonderful team that I work with. They do so much, not only to make these roundtables happen, but to actually get to more crypto clarity. So thank you to them. But for the roundtables specifically, Samira Yunus, Ileana Chobano, Landon Zinda, and Robert Tepley have all put in tremendous amounts of time on getting these task force together. So thank you. And they've always approached it with a mix of levity and organizational genius, which is a good combination. Thank you all for attending, whether here in person or online, and please stay in touch. Thank you all.
All righty. So that was that. That was the fifth and final one of these Crypto Task Force roundtables. Hopefully they do a couple more in the future. You could tell that it was very improvised because they hadn't appointed Atkins as the SEC chairman. So they needed to do something to look like they were being productive through this time. And I think that it's going to be even more productive in the future, when they bring in more people from DeFi, more people that have been affected, someone, let's say like Richard, that went through the court case, so they can bring in then that perspective. And then hopefully we'll have better regulation that gets out of the way, regulation that allows DeFi to flourish, and something that can help us in the future. So I got, I want to say 7 clips, so between 50 seconds up to 4 minutes. So we'll be talking about these probably on Saturday. If not, we'll just do a stream during the week. So I hope everyone's having a good one. And like I always say, catch us on the next one. We'll see you around the block.